Well, hello everyone, and today I thought I would do something a little bit different. I would like to talk about my 10 favorite science fiction novels. Last year I did my 10 favorite fantasy and sci-fi novels, but I've actually been reading science fiction a lot longer than I've been reading fantasy. Maybe not some of the same big names, but I grew up reading Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and Edgar Rice Burroughs, and so that sort of was like my bread and butter, especially when I was younger. And so I found it was easier for me to nail down a top 10 science fiction than it was fantasy. So that's what we're going to be talking about here today. If famous books are not on this list, it is probably because I have not read them, or read them and didn't love them as much as other people did. So, for example, Ender's Game, read it, it's not on this list. Hyperion is the first famous one that comes to mind. Have not read it, hope to soon. Vorkosigan Saga, have not read it, hope to soon. Let me also say this. So, I know that kind of the idea of a list is like, well, but if it's set in stone and your opinions change and as you read more, that's sort of why I'm doing this, is to benchmark out, like, okay, at this point in time, here are my 10 favorites, but as I read more, this will develop. Things will change around. But we're going to have a few honorable mentions here. The first is going to be the Cthulhu Mythos by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, this is not on the list, mainly because I haven't read enough of it. So I've read a good number of Lovecraft stuff, but not enough where it firmly cemented a seat on this list, so it won't be here. We'll also say Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Of the dystopian novels like Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson, 1984 by George Orwell, Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World is my favorite, and it's not even close, so it gets an honorable mention spot on this list. And then I'll also say A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. I mentioned Burroughs was a favorite of mine when I was younger, but I haven't read this in a very, very long time, and that might need to be remedied. So it is on the list. Some of these, and I'll also get this out of the way, guys, like the line between sci-fi and fantasy is almost non-existent, and so some, like A Princess of Mars, people could argue, well, that's actually a fantasy book. I don't care. We're going with this list, and these are at least sci-fi enough that I'm classifying them as such, and so we're going to be talking about them. And so this could be applied to several here, but one of the ones where it could really be applied to is The Mechanical by Ian Tregillis. This is a relatively new read for me. I read this in January of this year, January of 2025. This is a rather bizarre trilogy. It begins the Alchemy Wars trilogy, in which sort of the backstory of it is back during the time of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. The Protestants developed sort of clockwork robotic technology to go to war against the Catholics. And so rather than having in real history where a bunch of Protestants fled to America because of religious persecution from Catholics at the time, instead it's flipped, where because the Protestants have these robotic clockwork super weapons, almost like Terminators that they have that go to war for them, many Catholics flee to the New World because of religious persecution from the Protestants. And so The Mechanical, it sort of is set hundreds of years later, at the beginning of the 20th century, as it has now gone down this alternate history route. Plans have been set in order, both for sort of one final last gasp against the few remaining Catholic settlements, and the Protestants look to wipe them out. And the main Protestant factions are the Calvinists, which plays a big part into questions of free will. Do we have free will? But the other big element of this is we get inside the heads, and many of the main characters of this series are mechanical men. They're referred to as clackers in the books. And Jax, who is the mechanical that's referenced in this title, is sort of the main character of this first novel, and we see inside of his head as he's controlled by these alchemical geisha that compel him to do his master's will, that he's physically unable to disobey them when he's given a command. And we see how that compels him and drives him. And so there's a big question that's asked about free will and like how free are they really compared to humans and the things that move us and motivate us and compel us as well. And so this is a trilogy that is about uprising, that's about the clash between science and religion, that's asking some really interesting questions about the soul and consciousness and what motivates the mind in a lot of ways. And so I really like this. The first book, The Mechanical, was my favorite out of the trilogy, but many of the people who I read this with Alan, Charmaine, Pete, Anitha, Katie, many of them had different opinions on it as well. So some people liked book 3 the best. So I do think it is a very consistent trilogy. It is criminally underread, and more people should check it out. So for right now, it is 10th on my sci-fi list. And so number 9 on the list is going to be 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. I mentioned earlier I read a lot of Jules Verne when I was younger. And so this is my big bind-up that I have now of his many of his novels, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was my favorite. The story of Captain Nemo and the Nautilus that goes around sinking ships out of revenge, this submarine. And there's some bizarre stuff in this book, man. The giant squid attack is actually a movie edition. I'm trying to remember what it is. It's a different sea monster that attacks the Nautilus in the book, but they like travel to the sunken country of Atlantis in the book. But I loved this novel when I was younger. Jules Verne was probably my favorite author, or one of them. When I was younger, I really loved Around the World in 80 Days, but as far as his science fiction stuff goes, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was my favorite, and I really should reread it, because it's on here mainly because of the place that it holds in my heart, and the sense of adventure and being able to travel and feeling like you're stepping into another world that nobody had encountered at that time was just enchanting, and I loved it. And so the memories of that are really a lot of why it's here on the list, but I haven't read it in quite a long time. Something that I've read very recently that is going to be number 8 on our list is The Book of the Long Sun by Gene Wolfe. So this is part 2 in his solar cycle. Book of the Long Sun is called a sequel series to the Book of the New Sun, but in Book of the Long Sun, we hear the story of Patera Silk, who is a priest on what we come to learn is a massive world-sized spaceship that is in outer space that is so big and so world-like, and the people who are on the spaceship have lived there for so long that they have forgotten that it is even a spaceship. They just think it's the planet that they live on. And Patera Silk, who's a priest, and they worship gods that may or may not be the result of technology of the spaceship that they're actually worshiping, is encountered by a god that he's never interacted with, that's outside of his main pantheon. And this god warns him of a coming destruction to the world that they live in. And Patera Silk is commissioned by this strange god that's called the Outsider to basically save the world. And so it goes from being about just saving his local church and parish and school that he runs to saving his area of the city, saving the city. And as the series goes on, the mission expands and becomes about saving the world itself. So this I do not enjoy quite as much as Book of the New Sun, which we will see later on the list. But it is still very, very good. There are elements of this that I think will that'll click a lot better for me on a reread, and it's not because like, oh, you need to read Gene Wolfe stuff twice. You don't. But there's things that you know to look for once you see the ending of the story that you didn't know before. So there's still a lot to enjoy here. If you had issues with Book of the New Sun, with how unlikable Severian can be, if you found him confusing or difficult to follow, Book of the Long Sun is a lot clearer. Patera Silk, the main character, is much more likable. You actually get a cast of characters and see the story from several different points of view. So if you had trouble following Severian with just his one point of view and being stuck in his head all the time, you don't have that issue here. So if people bounce off Book of the New Sun, I think Book of the Long Sun, if they're still interested in trying Wolfe, is a great option. And also the clash between science and religion, once again, in this series is very, very good. Number 7 on our list here of favorite sci-fi books is going to get me laughed off if you haven't heard me talk about it already, but is Revenge of the Sith by Matthew Woodring Stover. So I have read a few of the Star Wars novels, and most of them I enjoy but never love as much as I am hoping, with one big exception, which is Stover's Revenge of the Sith, which is basically the best version of the Revenge of the Sith story that's out there. I like the movie. I probably like the movie a lot better than most people my age, but Stover just tells the story better. I don't know quite what it is. I think it is because he is very deliberate in being inside certain characters' heads. This is one thing that Matthew Stover said in interviews. He said, with this novelization, I was trying to think, what can I do with this story that you can only do in a book and that you can't do in a movie? And he said, nothing in my book will be able to beat how epic the lightsaber battles will be, or how crazy the spaceships are. So what can I do in a book that you can't do in a movie? And he said, I can get inside people's heads. I can make you feel what they're feeling. I can make you think what they're thinking. And there are several different points of things where in the movie, when I saw it, I was like, that's stupid. Why is that there? And because we're inside the character's head, because we see how they're processing things, Stover actually fixes things that I previously thought were flaws in the movie. So I think Stover just he doesn't change the story in any radical ways. Some parts, like with Count Dooku especially, and then also some parts with Palpatine, are expanded on. But also, Stover's just a very, very good writer. His writing is excellent. Let me just read you this. At the beginning of this, it's describing the big battle over the capital city planet that's going on, where Palpatine has been kidnapped by General Grievous, and Anakin and Obi-Wan are going off in their fighters to save him. And first of all, Stover does something so brilliant in this. Sorry, I know I'm taking a lot of time on this, but he begins by saying, this story happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It is already over. Nothing can be done to change it. And then he goes on, but he literally begins by saying, I know my whole audience will know how this story ends. They've all seen the movie. They all know how this is going to end. So I'm going to begin by telling you that, by saying hey, guess what? Nothing you can do will change the ending of this story. You already know it. And so there's a certain sense of dread and inevitability, and that nothing, as much as we hate to see these two brothers get torn apart throughout the course of this story, none of our wanting and wishing that it was different will change a thing. He's talking about adults who are talking to their younglings about the battle, and he says, these adults can take no comfort from their younglings. Palpatine is captured. Grievous will escape. The Republic will fall. No mere human beings can turn this tide. No mere human beings would even try. Not even Kenobi and Skywalker. And so it is that these adults across the galaxy watch the HoloNet with ashes where their hearts should be. Ashes, because they can't see two prismatic bursts of real space reversion far out beyond the planet's gravity well. Because they can't see a pair of starfighters crisply jettison hyperdrive rings and streak into the storm of separatist vulture fighters with all guns blazing. A pair of starfighters. Jedi starfighters. Only two. Two is enough. Because the adults are wrong and their younglings are right. Though this is the end of the age of heroes, it has saved its best for last. And even as I'm reading that, I get chills down my spine. Just Stover's writing is so, so good. So, I don't know, man. This is a hard book to pitch because it's a movie novelization. But, trust me, bro, it's brilliant. And indeed, it is. So if you have not read it, at least give it a taste test, man. So, number 6 on our list is going to be The Anubis Gates by Tim Powers. So Tim Powers has quickly become one of my favorite fantasy authors, and that's one of the tricky things, is that Tim Powers, a lot of what he writes really rides the line between, is it fantasy, is it horror, is it sci-fi? It's a little bit of both. The Anubis Gates is solidly a time travel story, so we get to call it science fiction, in which it's set during when the book was written, was modern day in the 1980s, where a billionaire has discovered some rips through the space-time continuum that have happened because of some Egyptian sorcerers back in the 1800s. And so they travel back in time to the 1800s to witness the Romantic poets and be able to experience history. And so they basically take history buffs back in time. And the main character, Brendan Doyle, is sort of a weak college professor, sort of a loser type. There's not much to him. And he gets stuck back in time and ends up getting hunted down by said Egyptian sorcerers. And the cool part of this story is not just the fun action, not just the sci-fi elements, and there's a lot of that in this book, but is also getting to see this character journey of the main character of Doyle as he goes from being this weak college professor who admires the ideals and the values that the Romantic poets aspire to, and not just admiring those things from afar off, but literally having to embody and live them out through the course of this adventure. And so Tim Powers does some, this is, once again, kind of a lame pitch for it, because I cannot express to you just how bizarre and trippy this novel is in a lot of ways. There is a psychopath killer clown who rules the criminal underworld, who will mutilate his henchmen so that they can be better beggars for him and part of his army. There is a body-swapping serial killer werewolf throughout the story that they have to face. There's like elemental fire spirits that get involved in the story. This is a weird, trippy novel. I've been told it's like if Philip K. Dick wrote like a historical fantasy novel. And funny enough, this actually, I believe, won like the Philip K. Dick Award, and Tim Powers was friends with Philip K. Dick. So if you're interested in Tim Powers, I think, sorry Jordan, I think my friend Jordan, who didn't like this book as much, I think this is a great place to start. It's maybe not the first one that I would give people just because his other books tend to be very different from this one, but I think this novel is a lot of fun, and it is one of my favorite science fiction novels. Number 5 on the list is going to be A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller. I have been meaning to read this book for forever. It is basically a collection of 3 novellas covering the same... I just talked about this in my wrap-up because I read this recently. And it covers the same monastery out in the western U.S. And in the first novella, it is shortly after a nuclear apocalypse, and the monastery is trying to gather pieces of information and trying to gather information about technology so that they can just hold on to it and preserve it in hopes that it will be of some use in bringing life back to humanity and bringing the culture and the nation, putting it back on its feet over the course of centuries. And then the next novella is set hundreds of years in the future, like 500 years later, in which we see the country starting to stand back up, the world starting to recover, and the infighting that happens, and the fight for this information that comes. And then the final one being set another 700 years in the future, in which mankind is on the brink of a nuclear apocalypse once again. And so there's a lot of things in here about mankind's the worst parts of them always getting the upper hand and always winning. But at the same time, the priests' refusal to despair, the monastery over time, their refusal to give in to the political scheming that's going on, their refusal to become a political entity rather than a spiritual and religious one, and them solidly believing that even when mankind is at its worst, that God is still in control, and that God can still make something good out of all the awful things that have happened. And so it is in some ways both a very depressing book and a very hopeful and joyful book. So I really liked it. It is a relatively easy read, and one that I hope to reread a lot, because it made me think a lot. Number 4 on the list is going to be Dune by Frank Herbert. I'm not going to talk about this long, because, like, what is there to say? Like, it's Dune, for Pete's sake. Other than to say that a lot of books I read, and they kind of go in one ear and out the other, and Dune has stuck with me. And it's not just because I've seen the movies, which I have, mixed feelings on, and it's not just because it's super popular, but the story of Dune and the journey of Paul Atreides, especially in this first book, has really stuck with me since I read it like 2-3 years ago. I think what Frank Herbert does in the way he tells the story, and having this omniscient narrator where you jump into different people's heads, where you know from like chapter 2 that Dr. Yueh is going to betray the Atreides family. And so you're just watching and waiting the whole time for the other shoe to drop. You're just waiting for it to happen because and nobody in the family can figure it out. And I think that writing element of it is really strong and really interesting. So I do like Dune. I'm not going to talk about it a whole lot here, but it is probably my 4th favorite science fiction novel. Number 3, and here we're getting into more like not just one novel, but like a series, and it's going to be The Sun Eater by Christopher Rocchio, the series that is wrapping up in just a few months. This series is one that has meant a lot to me. Getting to go on this journey with Hadrian Marlowe in his war against the Cielcen aliens, and discovering that there is much more in heaven and in earth than was ever dreamt up in his books of philosophy. I've done a lot of talking about The Sun Eater, so once again, I will keep this brief. But I'll say, I think Hadrian Marlowe's journey from being like the son of, literally the son of a devil, where Alistair Marlowe his name is Alistair for one, the Marlowe family, their emblem is the devil, and Hadrian is very much a self-centered, selfish character, and him becoming almost a paladin type of character. What the divine seeks of him becomes more and more important to him over the course of the story, and seeking to map his life onto a higher ideal becoming more and more important to him, rather than going just his own way and doing what he thinks is best. But honestly, becoming more humble over the course of the story is something that's meant a lot to me. So, Kingdoms of Death is always going to be one of my favorite books in the series. I think there's a lot of very powerful things about that, but up to this point, Disquiet Gods, I think, does the best in combining some of the Lovecraftian things, some of the political elements to the story, but then also just ramping up the weird. So I love it. Chapter 40. Need I say more? So, my second favorite science fiction novel, and we're going to go with a series once again here, is going to be, and once again, you could argue that this is fantasy, is the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis. So this is Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and then That Hideous Strength. And I'm holding up That Hideous Strength because it's my favorite. Out of the Silent Planet begins the trilogy, and we meet Elwyn Ransom, who is a college philologist. Say that 10 times fast. Similar to J.R.R. Tolkien, and so some people surmise that Lewis actually modeled Ransom off of Tolkien, and he is kidnapped by two of his colleagues from college, and is brought on a spaceship and flown into outer space, where they land on a planet. And these two, this is sort of written in the same vein as the First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells, or even A Princess of Mars, where you have the outsiders coming to the planet and then becoming hailed as super beings and that type of thing. And so Lewis is sort of riffing on that. Only what he has is these two who are trying to take over the planet. They're trying to corrupt the people there. And Elwyn Ransom is sort of there as an Old Testament prophet who's opposing the evildoers, who is seeking to preserve the innocent people there. And that happens again, but in a very different way, in a much more John Milton way in Perelandra. But my favorite is That Hideous Strength, in which the gods essentially come to Earth, in which the professor group, it actually is revealed that they're part of a much more evil, more demonic cabal that seek to resurrect the ancient wizard Merlin and sort of rebuild the Tower of Babel to achieve their own purposes. And so That Hideous Strength is much darker. It is probably Lewis's darkest book, but it's my favorite novel from Lewis, and I think more people should read it. And then last on the list is The Book of the New Sun, To the Surprise of No One by Gene Wolfe. This is one of my favorite series of all time. Birth of the New Sun is my favorite out of the series. If you take the novel as a whole and just call it one novel, this is one of my favorite novels of all time. The story of Severian the Torturer as he becomes the Autarch, which is told in the first chapter over the course of the story, just means a lot to me, and I think is really powerful. And Wolfe doesn't work for everyone, but I think everybody should try him. So I actually wanted to give a little bit more of my thoughts on New Sun here. I didn't want to cut it too short as far as things that I like about it. So, reasons as to why it's my favorite. I love that we get just the single point of view of a very damaged character, to many readers a very unlikable character. And we see him grow, and we see him change in very realistic ways over the course of the story. So to some people that's even frustrating, that we don't see dramatic change between books, that it's a very slow and gradual turn. As Severian says, he's a bad man that's trying to become good. And I really appreciate that. I really love that Wolfe doesn't pull back his punches, that there's parts of the book that will make readers very uncomfortable, that make me uncomfortable, as we see Severian grow and progress forward. I like that so much about the world building is not outright spelled out for us, it's implied. You have to look for it. You sort of look at it's sort of like looking for Easter eggs in the background of a movie, as you see things of how the world got to be where it is today, and you hear things and stories that other characters tell each other, and you sort of piece together from those stories what's probably fiction and what may very well be fact. I love the blending of sci-fi and fantasy elements, and that the more you learn about it, the more the fantasy things appear to be actually ancient technology, aliens, and actually occasionally supernatural things that just happen to our characters. And then I love how just Wolfe brings everything together by the end of the story. If you stop in Shadow of the Torturer or Claw, you're going to be confused. You're going to have a lot of unanswered questions. And it's not that you have every question answered by the end, but you get a better understanding of what's been going on the whole time once you get to the ending. And it kind of puts a burr under your saddle to go back and look for the answers and realize, I'm like, oh, some of these things were there the whole time. And I'm not one of those people who thinks you need to reread Book of the New Sun to understand it. No. But of course, you'll pick up things better when you reread it. For example, on my second reread of Shadow of the Torturer, I realized that there were elements in the first chapter, or the second chapter of Shadow of the Torturer, that were alluding to things near the end of Earth of the New Sun. Book 5, the book that people say Wolfe didn't even plan on writing, and yet he had still planted seeds for those elements that would be paid off way at the end of the series. And just the way that he pulls everything together is incredible to me. So I think just for Wolfe's level of a craftsman, I like it. But also, it's just a lot of fun. It's very gothic. It's very metal. You've got the Alzabo aliens, which are great. You've got the Hyrule. You've got Dr. Talos and Baldanders. You've got so many great elements of the series that just make it fun. But also, it just feels like a never-ending gold mine. Like there's always more to get out of it. And so it's not a series that I claim to have full understanding of. I'm very much a layman when it comes to it. But some people will say that Wolfe fans only like it to feel elitist or to feel intellectual, and I'm very much not that. There's a lot of things that there's a lot of so-called intellectual books that don't work for me. But with Wolfe, every time I go back to it, I ask myself, like, am I just liking this because I want to feel smart, or because it feels good, or you want to be highbrow or something like that? And every time I'm just like, oh no, I love this so much. If I could read this in like 2 other series, like I'd probably never read anything else again. So makes me wonder why I read anything else. So yeah, this is my favorite science fiction series. I don't expect it to ever be topped. Maybe the solar cycle as a whole I would put over just New Sun. But for right now, since we're splitting it up, yeah, Book of the New Sun, it's my favorite. It is one of my favorite books and series of all time, and definitely my favorite sci-fi. I'll say, guys, thank you for watching this video. I know I tend to be long-winded, especially in list videos like this, but I would be interested to hear people say both what they're surprised isn't on the list, what they think I will like, not just like, oh, here's a famous one, but like ones that you think that I'm really gonna click with. And I hope to do this again next year. Maybe see if it's changed at all. But thank you guys so much for watching this. I'll see you in the next one.